In the summer of 1906, a worker at a blast furnace facility in the Monongahela Valley in Pennsylvania went to his job the same way he had gone every day for 11 years. He walked through the gate, changed into his work clothes, took his position near the casting floor, and prepared to do work that he understood, work that he had done hundreds of times, work that had a routine to it that felt, if not safe exactly, then at least familiar. By the end of his shift, he was dead. The men who worked beside him carried his body out of the plant and went home to their own families, and the furnace kept running. It did not stop for him. It did not slow down. The iron kept pouring, the coke kept burning, and the plant superintendent filed the appropriate paperwork. Nobody held a hearing. Nobody changed a procedure. Why, his death was recorded in the company ledger under the heading that covered most of these incidents: accidental. His story is not unique. It is not even unusual. Between 1900 and 1920, the American iron and steel industry killed somewhere between 3 and 4 workers every single day. Not every year, every day. Blast furnaces accounted for a disproportionate share of those deaths because a blast furnace is not simply a dangerous machine. It is a system designed to maintain conditions that are actively lethal to human beings, surrounded by human beings who are required to be there. This is the story of what those conditions actually are, what the furnace does when it decides to kill someone, and why it was able to kill so many people for so long before the industry that depended on it admitted that anything needed to change. To understand why a blast furnace kills the way it does, you need to understand what it actually is. A blast furnace is, at its core, a reduction vessel. It takes iron ore, which is iron chemically bonded to oxygen, and it strips that oxygen away to produce metallite iron. The chemistry is ancient. Human beings have been doing versions of it for thousands of years, but the scale of a modern industrial blast furnace, which developed through the 18th and 19th centuries into the enormous structures that dominated the industrial landscape of Britain, Germany, and America by 1900, is something qualitatively different from anything that came before. A large blast furnace of the early 20th century stood between 25 and 30 meters tall. Its interior, lined with refractory brick, contained a continuously burning mass of coke, the fuel, iron ore, the raw material, and limestone, the flux that helps separate impurities from the iron. Hot air, preheated in enormous external stoves to temperatures around 900 degrees Celsius, was blasted into the bottom of the furnace through nozzles called tuyères. That hot air reacted with the burning coke to produce carbon monoxide, and it was the carbon monoxide, not the direct heat, that stripped the oxygen from the iron ore. At the bottom of the furnace, in the region called the hearth, liquid iron pooled. Above it, liquid slag. The waste material separated from the iron floated. Every 4 to 6 hours, a crew of workers would tap the furnace, opening a hole at the base called the tap hole, and allowing the iron to pour out through a channel in the cast house floor and into ladles or molds waiting below. The temperature at the tap hole as the iron poured out was approximately 1400 degrees Celsius. That is roughly 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough that objects placed near the stream of iron would ignite before they touched it. Hot enough that molten iron splashing onto a worker's boot could burn through the leather and the flesh below it before the worker had finished deciding whether to lift his foot. But direct contact with molten iron, as lethal as it is not the primary way that blast furnaces killed workers. The primary way was something invisible. Blast furnace gas is a byproduct of the reduction process. As the coke burns and the carbon monoxide reacts with the iron ore, gases rise through the furnace burden and exit at the top of the stack. These gases contain significant quantities of carbon monoxide. In early furnace operations, before gas recovery systems were developed, this gas was simply burned off at the furnace top in spectacular flares that were visible for miles. Later, as its heating value was recognized, blast furnace gas was recovered and used as fuel for the stoves and for other plant operations. The carbon monoxide content of blast furnace gas typically runs somewhere between 20 and 30% by volume. For reference, the concentration of carbon monoxide required to cause death after 30 minutes of exposure is approximately 0.1%. The gas coming off a blast furnace is roughly 200 to 300 times that concentration. Carbon monoxide kills in a specific way. It binds to hemoglobin in the red blood cells with an affinity approximately 250 times greater than oxygen. When you breathe air containing carbon monoxide, your blood begins loading carbon monoxide instead of oxygen. Your cells become oxygen starved. In low concentrations, the symptoms are headache, dizziness, and nausea, symptoms that, in the noisy, hot, physically demanding environment of a steel plant, are easy to attribute to a dozen other causes. In higher concentrations, the symptoms progress to confusion, loss of muscle control, and unconsciousness. Above certain thresholds, they progress to death. The insidious quality of this sequence is that it is self-reinforcing at the worst possible moment. As carbon monoxide poisoning advances and cognitive function deteriorates, the victim's ability to recognize what is happening to them and to take the action that would save their life, which is simply to move away from the source, degrades in proportion to the danger they are in. Workers found collapsed near blast furnace gas lines or in enclosed spaces adjacent to furnaces often died not because they had no chance to escape, but because by the time they recognized that something was wrong, the gas had already compromised their capacity to act on that recognition. Bureau of Mines investigations, conducted in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, documented this pattern repeatedly. In a bulletin published in 1914 summarizing blast furnace accident investigations across American iron and steel plants, the authors noted that a substantial proportion of the fatalities attributed to carbon monoxide poisoning occurred not in locations that were obviously hazardous, but in areas that workers entered routinely, areas where leaking gas had accumulated to dangerous concentrations without being detected. Detection was the problem. The gas is colorless. It has no odor. It gives no sensory warning of its presence. In an era before reliable gas detection instruments were available, the only reliable indicator that dangerous concentrations of blast furnace gas had accumulated in a space was the collapse of the first person to enter it. This is not a hypothetical scenario reconstructed from theoretical analysis. It is the documented sequence described in investigation after investigation, year after year, throughout the history of the industry. A worker enters a space. He does not come out. A second worker goes in to look for him. He does not come out. By the time someone outside puts together that two men are missing in the same location, the situation has escalated from a single casualty to multiple. At the Homestead Steelworks in Pennsylvania, which by the late 19th century had become one of the largest and most productive steel plants in the world, the death toll in the years between 1890 and 1910 was not a secret. It was a matter of public record, discussed in newspapers, investigated by journalists, and documented in the accounts of social reformers who were among the first Americans to treat industrial safety as a social rather than simply a commercial problem. Crystal Eastman, who conducted one of the most thorough investigations of industrial accidents in the early 20th century, published a study in 1910 called Work Accidents in the Law, which drew extensively on data from Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, the region that included Pittsburgh and its surrounding mill towns. She found that in a single year, 1906 and 1907, 526 men were killed in work accidents in that one county. Of those, more than 100 worked in the steel and iron industry. The actual number was almost certainly higher, as her methodology acknowledged that not all workplace deaths were reported in ways that made them traceable. The steel companies of this era did not dispute that men were dying. They disputed who was responsible. The dominant legal and cultural framework of the period placed responsibility for workplace accidents primarily on the workers themselves. Doctrines like contributory negligence, which held that a worker who contributed in any way to the circumstances of his own injury had no right to compensation, and the fellow servant rule, which shielded employers from liability when one worker was injured by the actions of another, made it legally difficult for injured workers or the families of dead ones to recover anything meaningful from the companies that employed them. The practical effect of this framework was to remove the financial incentive for companies to invest in safety. If a worker died and the company could claim he had been careless, the company's liability was minimal. If the company spent money on safety equipment and procedures that reduced deaths but also reduced output, the cost was immediate and certain. The benefit was diffuse and legally irrelevant to the company's bottom line. Men worked in conditions they understood to be dangerous because they had no alternative. The immigrants who filled the labor roles of the Monongahela Valley steel plants in the early 20th century, Slovaks, Poles, Hungarians, Italians, Ukrainians, men who had crossed an ocean for the chance to earn wages that their home countries could not offer them, did not have the leverage to refuse dangerous assignments. They had families to feed. The company had other men willing to take their places. This is the context in which the blast furnace killed them, not against their awareness of the risk, against their inability to do anything about it. The carbon monoxide problem was one mode of death, but it was not the only one, and in some respects, it was not the most dramatic. When a blast furnace operates normally, the iron and slag that pool in the hearth are contained by the refractory brick lining that forms the furnace wall. This lining is designed to resist extreme temperatures and to withstand the chemical attack of the molten materials pressing against it. In a well-maintained furnace with a properly cooled shell, the lining holds. The molten material stays where it belongs. But blast furnace linings do not last forever. They erode over time, worn away by the chemical reactions of the slag, damaged by thermal cycling as the furnace heats and cools. I physically abraded by the burden of iron ore and coke descending through the stack. In the early industrial era, when furnace operation was continuous and inspection was minimal, linings sometimes wore to a fraction of their original thickness without anyone noticing, because there was no practical way to observe the interior of an operating furnace. When the lining fails, the result is called a breakout. Molten iron or slag forces its way through the compromised wall and emerges outside the furnace shell. If the breakout is small and slow, it may be caught and managed before it becomes catastrophic. Workers can attempt to plug the breach with clay, can direct cooling water onto the furnace shell, can undertake the extremely hazardous task of working near molten material that is actively trying to find new places to flow. If the breakout is rapid, there is nothing to do except run. Molten iron at 1400 degrees Celsius flows with the consistency of water. It follows the path of least resistance, which in a cast house means the floor channels, the drainage routes, the any low-lying passage in the structure. It ignites anything combustible it contacts. It destroys anything mechanical. A worker caught between a breakout stream and a wall or obstacle dies not from explosion or impact, but from heat and from fire, from the radiant and conducted thermal energy of material hotter than the surface of some stars. The violence of a large breakout was, by multiple historical accounts, indistinguishable in its immediate effect from an explosion. Witnesses described the furnace shell bulging outward, then rupturing, then the molten iron arriving in the cast house in a wave. Workers near the tap hole, men who had been managing the controlled flow of iron moments before, had seconds to move. Those who moved lived. Those who hesitated or were trapped by their position in the building did not. At the Bethlehem Steel Plant in South Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, at the Carnegie Steel facilities in Pittsburgh and Homestead, at the Cambria Iron Company works in Johnstown, the investigation reports and the newspaper accounts from the decades between 1880 and 1930 describe breakout incidents with a regularity that suggests they were understood as an occupational hazard rather than a failure of management. Men died in breakouts. The furnaces were repaired. Men continued to work near them. There is a third mechanism, and in many respects, it is the one that produces the most sudden and the most incomprehensible violence. It is the steam explosion. Water and molten iron are incompatible in a way that produces consequences disproportionate to the scale of the water involved. When water contacts a substance at 1400 degrees Celsius, it does not simply boil. It undergoes an instantaneous phase transition, expanding from liquid to steam at a ratio of approximately 1 to 1700 times its original volume. When that expansion is partially constrained by the surrounding molten material and the furnace structure, the result is a pressure pulse that behaves in every practically relevant sense like an explosive detonation. The energy released in a steam explosion involving a few liters of water contacting molten iron is sufficient to project fragments of solidified metal, refractory brick, and furnace hardware at lethal velocities for distances of many tens of meters. The sound of such an explosion has been described by survivors as being distinct from any other industrial noise, a crack rather than a boom, sharp and close, and followed immediately by the impact of debris. The mechanisms by which water contacted molten iron in blast furnace operations were numerous. Cooling water lines, which ran around the furnace shell and through the two-year assemblies to prevent the furnace structure from overheating, could develop leaks. When a leaking cooling line allowed water to enter the furnace hearth or to contact the stream of iron pouring from the tap hole, the result was immediate. Rainwater, collecting in low-lying areas of the cast house floor, in the drainage channels and depressions where iron might flow during a breakout, could produce the same effect if molten iron reached those areas. Tools and equipment inadvertently left in positions where they could be contacted by iron could carry moisture that triggered the same reaction. The Bureau of Mines investigations of the early 20th century documented steam explosion fatalities at blast furnace facilities across the country. In several cases, the investigation could only reconstruct the sequence of events from physical evidence, because the explosion had killed all witnesses in the immediate vicinity. The investigators would find the pattern of debris throw, identify the probable origin point, and work backward through the physical evidence to determine how water had reached the molten iron. In one documented investigation from a Midwestern steel plant in the 1910s, investigators found that the proximate cause of an explosion that killed 3 workers was a small accumulation of water in a depression in the cast house floor, water that had been there for a period of days, water that had been stepped over and worked around by the shift crews who saw it as a nuisance rather than a mortal hazard. When the iron tapped, that shift flowed into the channel where the water had pooled. The explosion was essentially instantaneous. 3 men died because of water in a puddle. The Welsh iron-making industry, which in the mid-19th century was the most productive in the world, and which served as the technical model from which much of the American industry developed, had its own extensive history of blast furnace deaths. The ironworks at Merthyr Tydfil, at Ebb W. Vale, at Dowlais, at Rhymney, employed tens of thousands of men in conditions that combined all of the hazards of the blast furnace process with the additional dangers of inadequate ventilation, 12 and 14-hour shifts, and a total absence of safety regulation. In 1848, a parliamentary inquiry into accidents in ironworks and collieries in South Wales took testimony from workers and managers at the major ironmaking sites. The testimony described conditions that would be recognizable to any student of the subsequent American experience. Workers were expected to manage molten iron in conditions that provided minimal protection from burns and splashes. The gas from the furnace tops was not recovered but burned in flares that sometimes went out, allowing unburned gas to drift across the site. Breakouts were managed by the workers nearest to them with whatever tools were at hand. The managers who testified before that inquiry did not dispute that men died. They disputed, with great consistency, that anything could practically be done about it. The nature of the work, they argued, inherently involved risk. The men who did it understood that. Their wages reflected it. To introduce safety measures that would reduce output or require the furnace to be shut down for inspection was, in this framing, to place a burden on the industry that would ultimately harm the very workers it was meant to protect by making their employment less economically viable. This argument was not made cynically, or not entirely cynically. It was a genuine reflection of the economic logic that governed industrial operations in an era when there was no external regulatory constraint on that logic. It was also, from the perspective of the workers who died while the argument was being made, a form of moral evasion that would eventually become impossible to sustain. The evasion became impossible to sustain, not because the industry's conscience was changed, but because the political environment was changed. In the United States, the progressive era reforms of the early 20th century, driven partly by the journalism of writers like Upton Sinclair, even partly by the investigative work of organizations like the Russell Sage Foundation, which funded Crystal Eastman's research, and partly by the organizing efforts of industrial workers themselves, created a political constituency for workplace safety regulation that had not previously existed. In 1908, the American Iron and Steel Institute published statistics on accidents in the industry that, even by the standards of an organization that was not inclined towards self-criticism, were striking. The accident rate in blast furnace operations was among the highest of any major industry in the country. The fatality rate per worker per year was multiples of what prevailed in European iron and steel plants operating under different regulatory and cultural conditions. The comparisons with Europe were particularly uncomfortable for the industry. German steelmakers had been implementing systematic safety programs since the 1880s, partly in response to the social insurance legislation introduced under Bismarck, which created financial incentives for companies to reduce accidents by tying employer contributions to accident rates. British steelmakers had been operating under factory inspection legislation since the 1840s, legislation that was imperfect and often poorly enforced, but that nonetheless established a principle of regulatory oversight that had no American equivalent. American steelmakers argued that higher production volumes and faster pace of operations made comparisons with European plants misleading. Some of this argument was genuinely true. American blast furnaces in the early 20th century were larger and ran harder than their European counterparts, and some of the additional risk was an unavoidable concomitant of that production intensity. But the investigations consistently found that a substantial proportion of the deaths were attributable not to the inherent hazards of the process, but to conditions that could have been modified. Cooling water systems that leaked and were not repaired, gas lines that were known to be defective and were not shut down for maintenance during periods when the furnace was running, inspection intervals that were determined by production requirements rather than by any systematic assessment of lining wear. The Bethlehem Steel Company, under the leadership of Charles Schwab after he left Carnegie Steel, just became one of the first American steel producers to take industrial safety seriously as a management function rather than simply a legal liability. Schwab introduced systematic accident investigation, safety committees, and financial incentives tied to accident reduction. Between 1910 and 1920, Bethlehem Steel's accident rate declined significantly. The reduction was real, measurable, and documented in the company's own records. The significance of that decline was not primarily about Bethlehem Steel. It was about what it demonstrated. The deaths in other plants, in the plants where accident rates remained high, were not inevitable. They were a management choice. A choice made by weighing the cost of safety measures against the cost of accepting worker deaths as a line item on the operating budget. The passage of workers' compensation legislation across American states in the years between 1910 and 1920 began to change that calculus. When the cost of a worker's death became a direct liability on the employer's balance sheet rather than an externality absorbed by the worker's family, the financial logic of safety investment changed. Not instantly and not uniformly. Workers' compensation rates were often inadequate. The administrative processes for recovering them were difficult to navigate for immigrant families with limited English, and employers fought compensation claims vigorously. But the direction of travel had changed. The number of blast furnace fatalities in American plants declined through the 1920s and 30s, partly because of workers' compensation, partly because of the development of better gas detection equipment, instruments that could warn workers of dangerous carbon monoxide concentrations before those concentrations were capable of incapacitating them, partly because of improvements in furnace design that made breakouts less likely and less catastrophic when they occurred, partly because of cooling water systems that were better designed and better maintained. But the decline was uneven, and it was never complete. Blast furnaces continued to kill workers throughout the 20th century, in the United States, in Britain, in Germany, in Japan, in every country where iron and steel were made on an industrial scale. The specific incidents that prompted specific improvements were different in different places, but the pattern was consistent. A death or a series of deaths would expose a particular hazard. An investigation would document what had happened. New procedures or equipment would be developed in response. The hazard addressed by those procedures would kill fewer workers going forward. And some other hazard, one that had been present all along but had not yet produced the specific incident that would make it visible to the people with the authority to address it, would continue to kill. In 1971, the year after the Occupational Safety and Health Act took effect in the United States and created for the first time a comprehensive federal framework for workplace safety regulation, a survey of blast furnace operations in American steel plants found that a number of practices that investigators had identified as contributing to fatalities decades earlier were still common. Gas line maintenance procedures that fell short of what the available evidence indicated was necessary to prevent dangerous leaks. Cooling water system designs that had been criticized in Bureau of Mines bulletins from the 1920s. Cast house floor designs that created drainage conditions favorable to the accumulation of water in locations where it could contact molten iron. The men doing this work in 1971 were the grandsons of the men who had died in documented incidents in the 1910s and 20s. The hazards that surrounded them were recognizably the same hazards. The main thing that had changed was that there was now a federal agency with the authority to inspect their workplace and to impose financial penalties on their employer if those hazards were not addressed. The steel industry fought OSHA vigorously in the early years. Compliance costs were real. The imposition of outside regulatory authority on operations that had been managed internally for decades was culturally disruptive, and some of the early OSHA standards were, in fairness, developed without adequate technical input from the industry and were not optimally designed for the specific conditions of blast furnace operations. But the trajectory after 1970 was clear. American blast furnace fatality rates declined more sharply in the 1970s than they had in any comparable period in the history of the industry. The regulatory framework worked imperfectly, frustratingly slowly, with enormous amounts of litigation and rulemaking and argument, but it worked. What does it mean that it took until 1970 for the United States to have a federal workplace safety law? What does it mean that the hazards that were killing workers in blast furnaces in 1970 were the same hazards that had been documented in Bureau of Mines investigations 50 years earlier? It means that for half a century, the gap between what was known about how to make blast furnaces less lethal and what was actually done to make them less lethal was filled with something. That something was not ignorance. The technical knowledge existed. It was documented, published, and accessible to the engineers and managers who ran the plants. The something was a calculation, an implicit, or rarely articulated, but functionally real calculation that the lives of the workers who might be saved by implementing the known safety measures were worth less than the cost and inconvenience of implementing them. The men who made that calculation, or who benefited from it being made by others, did not think of themselves as people who were trading workers' lives for production numbers. Most of them would have been genuinely offended by that characterization. They thought of themselves as practical men operating within the economic and legal constraints of their time, making the best decisions available to them given those constraints. The constraints were real. But the constraints were also, in significant part, political choices. The decision not to require workplace safety inspection was a choice. The legal doctrines that stripped injured workers of their right to compensation were choices. The failure to fund Bureau of Mines investigators adequately enough to follow up on their own documented findings was a choice. These choices benefited some people and cost others. The people they cost were the ones who couldn't leave the job. Subscribe to this channel if these industrial history documentaries are something you want more of. Every week there is a new story where the engineering, the history, and the human cost come together in ways that the standard history books tend to leave out. Hit the subscribe button now so you don't miss the next one. The blast furnaces of the Monongahela Valley are mostly gone now, the plants that line the riverbanks of Pittsburgh and its satellite towns. The plants that employed hundreds of thousands of people and produced the steel that built American cities and armed American armies were shut down in the 1970s and 80s as the industry contracted and restructured. The riverbanks where the furnaces stood have been redeveloped, converted into parks and trails and shopping centers. The infrastructure of the industrial age has been replaced by the infrastructure of the post-industrial one. The blast furnace workers who died in those plants are not well remembered. There are no monuments to the men killed in Homestead breakouts or to the men who collapsed in gas-filled tunnels at Pittsburgh area plants in the 1910s and 20s. The names of individual workers who died in individual incidents appear in Bureau of Mines reports and in newspaper accounts that are accessible only in archives, if at all. The aggregate numbers, the 3 to 4 deaths per day in the American steel industry at its peak production periods, appear in academic studies of industrial safety history that are read by specialists. This is partly because the deaths accumulated gradually, without a single catastrophic incident that created a narrative hook for public memory. The worst year at the worst plant still produced deaths at a rate that might be a few dozen over 12 months, spread across a workforce of thousands, mourned in the immigrant communities of the mill towns without broader publicity. Absorbed by an industry with the political connections and the legal tools to manage the consequences. Those deaths did not coalesce into the kind of singular event that generates lasting public memory. But they were not random or unpredictable or inevitable. They were the foreseeable result of operating machinery capable of killing workers in known ways, in proximity to workers who could not effectively protect themselves, without adequate investment in the measures that would have reduced the killing. The blast furnace is still in operation around the world. In China, in India, in Brazil, in South Korea, in Germany, men still tap heats of iron at 1400 degrees and breathe air in proximity to systems carrying lethal concentrations of carbon monoxide. Plus, the engineering knowledge required to make those operations substantially safer than the American steel industry of 1910 exists and has existed for decades. Whether it is fully applied in every plant, in every shift, in every decision made by a maintenance supervisor weighing a known but improbable hazard against the cost and disruption of addressing it is a different question. The furnace does not care about the answer. It will run as hot and as carelessly as it is allowed to run. It always has. And before you go, drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. This channel reaches people from every corner of the globe, and genuinely, the best part of making these videos is reading where they land. Type your country or your city, and let's see how far this one travels.